In 1975, as Mozambique became independent, Frelimo acquired a property 18 kilometers north-northeast of Chimoyo town known locally as Adriano's Farm, or New Farm. It was handed to ZANU, the political movement whose armed wing, ZANLA, was fighting Rhodesia from exile. On paper, it was a refugee center. On the ground, it became something much larger, and that duality is why the argument has never ended. Rhodesian intelligence called it the front, the main operating headquarters. ZANLA called it home. By late 1977, the complex held an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 inhabitants. It was described in contemporary military reports as a series of ZANLA-run refugee camps and training facilities and a launchpad for insurgents infiltrating Rhodesia. Walk the inventory compiled after the war, and you see why both labels fit. At the center was the old farmhouse, the White House, residence of the General Staff including Josiah Tongagura. Around it spread a purpose-built city. There was Pararinyatwa Camp Hospital, Takawira Camp 1 for general military training, Takawira Camp 2 for engineering and anti-aircraft training for cadres trained in China, Yugoslavia, and Tanzania. There was Chitepo College of Ideology for political indoctrination, Chindanduma Camp, a general school, Mbuya Niranda A female military training camp, and right beside it Mbuya Niranda B, a gynecology and obstetrics clinic, Pisatini Camp, a rehabilitation unit for disabled and wounded guerrillas, Chamanuka Camp, internal security doubling as a prison, Zvede Zvevenhu Camp, the ordnance and vehicle pool, Pasichigare Camp for traditional healers and spirit mediums, and Sekuru Kaguvi Camp, a care home for pension cadres or their older relatives. This was not a conventional barracks hidden in the bush. It was a political and military hub rolled into one and would have included some family members of the camp's military and political occupants. That sentence, written decades later by a Zimbabwean commentator trying to untangle the legal question, captures the untold part that both sides prefer to simplify. Rhodesia needed Chimoyo to be only a military base to justify a cross-border strike. ZANU needed it to be only a refugee camp to secure protection under international law and to mobilize outrage. The physical truth was that it was both, by design. For the thousands of young Zimbabweans who had crossed the border in 1976 and 1977 after the Soweto uprising and the escalation inside Rhodesia, Chimoyo was an intake, a school, a clinic, and basic training. Many had not yet been issued a weapon. Many were teenage girls assigned to Mbuya Niranda A. Many were children in Chindanduma. That collocation was not accidental. ZANLA doctrine, like many liberation movements of the era, fused civilian and military life. Rhodesian doctrine, built around preemptive external raids, treated any such fusion as making the entire location a valid target. Operation Dingo was not a ground battle that escalated. It was an air plan designed to exploit a ritual. Rhodesian planners knew the camp assembled for morning parade. The intention of concentrated air and ground firepower was to exploit the concentration of inhabitants, both refugees and militants, on the parade ground for morning parade. To increase the density, a deception was added. 10 minutes before the strike, a Douglas DC-8 airliner was flown over the camps. The inhabitants had heard false alarms before. They assumed another one and did not disperse or try to take cover when the bombers subsequently approached. At 0745, 4 Canberra bombers dropped 1,200 Alpha bombs, Rhodesian-designed anti-personnel bombs, over an area 1.1 kilometers long and 500 meters wide. They were followed by Hunter fighter bombers and 6 mothballed Vampire jets brought back into service for the operation, then by 10 Alouette 3 helicopter gunships, the KCARs, which inflicted the majority of casualties on fleeing groups. On the ground, 96 SAS troopers, 48 RLI paratroopers and another 40 helicopter-borne RLI troops were inserted into stop groups and sweep lines. The morning parade had been cancelled that day, which made the cluster strike on the parade ground itself less effective than planned, but the surrounding camps were full. Mozambican German boxer Ibrahimo Alberto, then a child, later described narrowly surviving an attack by Rhodesian aircraft during the operation, which bombed his school, killing many children. Rhodesia lost 2 men. SS Trooper F.J. Nell was shot at Chimoyo, and Flight Lieutenant Philip Haig was killed trying to crash-land his Vampire, which had no ejection seat. On the other side, the numbers immediately diverged and have never converged. According to the Rhodesian government, at least between 1,200 and 3,000 ZANLA guerrillas were killed in Operation Dingo. Most other sources put the death toll from the operation at over 1,000, including hundreds of civilians. with a specific breakdown often given as 1,200 to 3,000 killed or seriously injured, including guerrillas, civilians, and hospital patients. What happened in the hours after explains why the civilian count matters. The SAS left a stay-behind ambush force overnight to kill anyone returning, then withdrew. A similar attack was repeated at Tembu 2 days later. Mozambican forces at a nearby Frelimo base did not intervene. When aid workers and Mozambican officials entered, they found not just trenches and rifle pits but classrooms, clinic beds, and mass graves that the national museums and monuments of Zimbabwe later marked, at least 12 clustered around the main complex. Bishop Abel Muzorewa, hardly a ZANLA sympathizer and the leader of the moderate nationalist movement, called a week of mourning for raids on both camps as they contain many civilian refugees. That contemporary reaction from inside Rhodesia is often left out of both heroic versions. The most revealing document is not Zimbabwean or Rhodesian. It is American. On December 4, 1977, 11 days after the raid, the US Department of State cabled its embassy in Pretoria. The cable, now declassified, is titled The Rhodesian Raid on Chimoyo. It begins, "As more complete reports reach us, it is clear that many civilians were killed as well as guerrillas." It continues with instructions to tell Ian Smith's envoy and the South Africans that more complete reports, including eyewitness accounts, have now made clear that a substantial number of women and children as well as young men were killed in the raid on Chimoyo. Washington was not trying to score propaganda points for ZANU. Its concern was coldly strategic, that the reliance on raw military power would destroy any chance of a negotiated settlement, and that images of brutal methods would erode whatever sympathy whites in southern Africa enjoyed in the US and Europe. The cable even mentions enclosing photos and stories on brutal methods given prominent play by Washington papers. That is the first untold truth that survives fact-checking. Even Rhodesia's closest Western interlocutors concluded within days, from eyewitness accounts, that the dead included a substantial number of women and children. The second untold truth is the legal one that Rhodesia understood and that modern international humanitarian law still wrestles with. Was Chimoyo a legitimate military target? Chimoyo was a large ZANLA encampment and training facility that was a launchpad for armed liberation fighters infiltrating into Rhodesia. Under Article 52 of the Geneva Conventions, military objectives are limited to those objects that by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action. A headquarters, an ordnance depot, an anti-aircraft training camp, and barracks clearly qualify. A hospital, a gynecology clinic, a primary school, and a care home do not lose protection simply because they are inside the wire of a larger base, and proportionality requires that harm to protected civilians not be excessive in relation to concrete military advantage. Rhodesia argued that the integration was ZANLA's choice and responsibility. ZANLA argued that the presence of civilians was precisely why Rhodesia should not have bombed a refugee center. Both arguments served a purpose after the fact. The US cable shows that the immediate, non-propaganda assessment accepted that both were true at once, that a military headquarters had been hit, and that a large number of protected people inside it had been killed. That is why the death toll is always given as a composite. Historians now avoid the binary of all guerrillas versus all refugees, because the camp registers and the graves show the categories overlapped. A 17-year-old girl in Buyananda A could be listed as a trainee in Rhodesian files, a refugee in UNHCR files, and a schoolchild in her family's memory. A nurse in Pararinyatwa was both medical staff and ZANLA personnel. An older relative in Sekuru Kaguvi was a civilian by any definition but lived in a military headquarters zone. So did Rhodesian forces kill innocent civilians at Chimoyo? The fact-based answer supported by the majority of sources, by third-party diplomatic reporting, and by the physical layout of the camp itself is yes, hundreds did die alongside combatants. The operation killed over 1,000 people, including hundreds of civilians, and that included women and children acknowledged even in confidential US assessments at the time. The deeper untold truth, and the reason this story still trends every November when Zimbabwe commemorates it, is not that one side lied and the other told the truth. It is that modern irregular war had created a place that was simultaneously a legitimate military target under the law of war and a place full of people protected by that same law, and that a military that chose to attack it with area weapons at 7:45 in the morning chose, knowingly, to kill both.